be enough for me to slide these things aside? Would that be okay? Do this.
Can you hear me now? Oh, yeah, you can. All right, guys. Thank you, Jack, for playing. Steve loved dancing with Jack, or dancing to the music of Jack with our children at the Manhattan Beach Farmers Market. So he holds a special place in our family's heart. So it's wonderful to have him here. So I want to thank you all for coming here today to celebrate the life of Steve Morris. Steve was at the center of our family unit, though if you asked him, he would say it's his daughter, Jenny, my amazing wife, as he always put her first above anyone and everything. I want to share with you that before Steve passed, he wished all of you happiness and asked that you not be sad about his passing. He wanted all of us to come together and celebrate life, not our loss of him. Even though Steve stated that was his wish, we all know that Steve would also want you to feel every emotion and would be understanding that you may shed a tear for the loss of him. Also, if you feel sad, please feel that way, as I do not think it is the first time you or any of us had a difference of opinion with Steve on a matter. We all know Steve relished a good debate on any topic, so why not honor him through his second favorite pastime, his first being watching Clippers basketball. Collectively, we all shared a bond with Steve, and my hope is that we all can continue to share his light by celebrating him here today and continuing to share every experience, lesson, or moment we shared with Steve so that his legacy lives on amongst us, his family, friends, and community, and hopefully the rest of the world. Steve was many things to all of us. He was a father, brother, cousin, husband, friend, confidant, counselor, coworker, business partner, business coach, court jester, master of the chicken dance. If you follow Jenny's social media, you know what I'm talking about. Grill master, for better or worse, depending on who you asked, and a spiritual guide in those pivotal moments when you may have been lost in despair or tackling challenges as you embarked on a new adventure or chapter in your life. He was also all of those things we are also proud to share with everyone when we talk about Steve, a trailblazing entrepreneur in the marijuana counterculture of the 70s, one of the members of the team of the engineers at JPL who designed the Mars rover, and a devoted husband and father. Steve's unconditional love for Jenny, my children, and myself has left an indelible mark on the four of us that we will cherish for eternity. The devotion, care, and affection he showered upon Jenny and my girls, Sadie and Marnie, was otherworldly, almost godly. Here he goes. Go ahead, Devin. Steve would do anything for Jenny, Sadie, and Marnie. So in his honor and memory, I want to share with you some of those moments I witnessed. As we all know, Jenny was the sun in Steve's universe. Everything he did evolved around her. Steve always found a way to be there for her and available to Jenny at all costs. When Susie passed, Steve figured out a way to return home to Santa Monica from his job at JPL in Pasadena by 3:30 every day. Only Steve would figure out how to navigate LA traffic to make that happen. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of the freeways and surface streets of this vast city that he called home. After Jenny went away to college in Boulder, Colorado, Steve landed himself on a project that required him to travel to Boulder at least once a month. During every visit to Boulder, Steve would lavish Jenny and her friends with amazing dinners and conversation. Later, after Jenny graduated college, moved to New York, and then returned to Colorado, fortunately for me, Steve continued to persist in finding ways to protect her and nurture Jenny. For instance, when Jenny and I adopted our first dog, Baron, Jenny did not trust just anyone to watch our precious little pup, which Steve knew. So when Jenny was so worried about leaving the dog with a stranger that she was considering bailing on a trip to Costa Rica with me, of course, Steve would come to her rescue to ensure Jenny would have the opportunity to go on the trip. Steve ended up flying out from LA to stay at our house in the Colorado Rockies just to watch Baron for 10 days during a very cold and snowy January. Even though we know He hated the cold and he hated the snow. I think he spent the entire time sitting in the house with just the dog, but only peering out every so often to let the dog go to the bathroom. The poor dog had the worst separation anxiety, and to ensure Jenny's well-being and to prevent her from worrying, Steve never left the house to even get something to eat. So the dog was never alone. When we got back, he said he enjoyed himself, but I think it might have been the most boring 10 days of his life. After Jenny became a mother, he started texting Jenny every morning at about 7 a.m. just to see how her and the kids were. After she responded, he would tell her how much he loved her and the kids. Without failing, he did this every day. Every day. Steve also showered me with his unconditional love, despite the fact I don't think he ever wanted a son. To back up my theory, I want you to know that Steve was in despair when he learned that our first child was supposed to be a boy at our gender reveal. I mean, he literally was just distraught and couldn't believe that he was going to have a grandson. When he later discovered that the doctor was wrong and we were actually having a girl, Steve broke out in tears of joy and tried to assure me that having girls would be better for me. Steve, you're right. I've been thinking a lot recently about the day I started my path to becoming Steve's son-in-law and asked Steve for permission to marry Jenny. He was living in Lake Arrowhead at the time, so I came up with this cover story to set up my clandestine mission to ask him for his only daughter's hand in marriage. My cover was that I was heading to Big Bear for a meeting with a prospective client, and I wanted to meet Steve for lunch since I was coming up that way. I thought I had developed the perfect cover story, and I would catch Steve by surprise. I was wrong. Steve suspected I was coming to ask him this particular question, and to prove he knew this, he had written down on a Post-it note, "Tyler's going to ask me if he can marry Jenny." He placed that Post-it note in the back of his back pocket before he left and headed out to meet me that day. At the lunch, and seconds after I worked up the nerve to ask Steve's permission, Steve stands up and pulls the Post-it note out and throws it on the table, screaming, "Francine, I knew it! I knew it! See, I wrote it down right here. Tyler's asking me if he can marry Jenny. I knew it!" Stephen then reveled in his clairvoyance for a couple of minutes without giving me any response or indication that he felt one way or another. After Steve pointed to his note 2 more times, and I acknowledged that it said what it said 2 more times, I finally worked up the nerve to ask him, "Well, what is your answer?" To which he responded, "Yes." Just as stoically as I just presented, just yes. I will never forget this moment, and I hope to ambush my future son-in-laws in the same way. As the years passed, he accepted me into his family. Steve was always supported me the same way he supported Jenny. He supported me through many ups and downs and never once passed judgment upon any decision I made. He just listened and gave unconditional support, even if he didn't agree. Steve treated my children exactly the same way as he treated Jenny and myself, which should be of no surprise to us all. He went to almost every one of Sadie and Marnie's dance classes, tennis lessons, horseback riding lessons, gymnastics classes, and school events, even if it was hard for him because his back or knees hurt. And he didn't like to go anywhere, really. Steve let us transform his backyard so that the girls could come play, simply because Jenny and I don't have a backyard. And he felt the kids deserved it. He would perform the chicken dance for hours for Sadie and Marnie, even if he was physically exhausted from the constant requests. And every time he was done, he'd tell me, "Oh boy, is it exhausting having kids," but he was still very happy. My daughter Sadie may want to say a few words about her grandpa. Do you want to come up and say a few words? It's okay if you're scared. Don't look at everyone. You can just talk this way.
Grandpa loves us and he always feels so happy and he loves doing the chicken dance and me and Marnie love it and we dance with him.
Thank you, Sadie. That was wonderful. Marnie? So proud of you for being so brave. What do you want to say? You love Grandpa? Grandpa's great?
I love you, loving Grandpa.
Oh, that's sweet. Go sit back down. Now, I want to hand over the microphone to Norman Kola, a longtime friend of Steve's and a member of his extended family. My wife and I are looking forward to hearing from each of you here today, and those who could not attend about your experience with Steve. So please don't hesitate to share your thoughts.
Didn't you want Lillian to say something first?
No.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay. Well, here comes Lillian to say some very happy words. Okay, here we go.
Hey, y'all. I'm Lillian. I'm Uncle Steve's niece. And I'm here to say the blessing and also I'm going to share just a little bit. And Tyler, I think like all of us, I am really sad today, selfishly sad. My Uncle Steve has been a part of my life from the very beginning. He fished me out of the pool when I fell in it as a toddler, and that's one of my very earliest memories. He always brought the best birthday presents every single year. He drove up to my college graduation. He was there for my wedding, for when my 3 boys became bar mitzvahs, and for so many events in my life, large and small. We had some great discussions over the years about politics, about medicine, about what his teenage daughter might be thinking, since I was once one. How could he possibly be gone, But we're not here today just to be sad. We're here to talk about the beloved uncle, father, grandfather, brother, cousin, husband, and friend who meant so much to all of us. We're here to revel in his life. As our blessing, I want to share a poem by Rabbi Alan Mahler, who was actually the rabbi at my family's congregation, Temple Akiba in Culver City, for 39 years. He left in 2006, right before our family joined. When I die, if you need to weep, cry for somebody walking the street beside you. You can love me most by letting hands touch hands and souls touch souls. You can love me most by sharing your simchas or goodness and multiplying your mitzvot or acts of kindness. You can love me most by letting me live in your eyes and not in your mind. And when you say Kaddish for me, remember what our Torah teaches. Love doesn't die. People do. So when all that's left of me is love, give me away. And that's what we're here for today. Today's the day when those of us who knew Steve best and loved him most get to share that love and tell his stories and celebrate the life he led so passionately and so fully. By giving him away, we let him live on. So let's get started. Norman, you're back.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Hey, Brad, thanks for creating this forum. It's a beautiful place to celebrate Steve. So what a beautiful place. Steve would really like being here. He'd like hanging out. He's smiling. So see it as a smile. Hi, Bobby. I love Steve. He was the most loyal friend I've ever had, and I will ever have. Steve committed. No holding back. When he looked your way, he was seeing something, and he either liked it or did not. You would soon find out. Pat Schwartz, I believe there's Pat. I believe Pat was a friend of Steve's longer than anyone else that is here today. And she introduced Steve to my lovely Kathy and myself at her home in 1980 after Pat beat out my Kath to become a court commissioner. Class move, Pat. It was a wonderful introduction that opened a series of friendships with people connected to Steve, including David Schwartz, her husband, Arnie and Carol Vinstein. Hi, Arnie. Hi, Sam. And Chuck and Cheryl Diamond. I see Cheryl's here somewhere with Sean, There they are. Yeah. And there several of the speakers to follow are intertwined with those friendships. And thank you, Pat, for making that part of our life. And of course, we must mention the marvelous Susie. Oh my, how Steve loves Susie. We all love Susie, whose smile and spirit still lives within all of us who were her friend. When Steve lost Susie, he lost a piece of himself. He always felt that loss. But Susie gave Steve Jenny. And folks, Tyler knows what was going on there because Steve never stopped thinking about Jenny. If you spent time with Steve, he spoke to or spoke of Jenny during your time together, or you didn't spend much time with him that day. Thank you, Jenny and Tyler, for your devotion to Steve. Francine, I know you're here somewhere. There you are. Thank you for those last days of warmth and nurturing of your special friend to the beyond. Jenny, you know Steve loved you unconditionally, notwithstanding challenging you constantly. Remember, we're often the hardest on those closest to us. On my front, according to Steve, he fought to bring me into our annual backpacking group that ventured into the High Sierras every September for the best part of 20 years. Every year we would walk past the hunters at the beginning of hunting season and hike up to 10,000 plus feet to camp, fish, and explore. Our fearless leader was the late, great Chuck Diamond, with the late, great Arnie Finstein trailing just behind Chuck. David next, and then the old pro, Steve, with yours truly. As we enjoyed these adventures, we learned about each other and became close friends. Arnie also hosted a weekly dinner for many years that fostered our bonds. There are many Steve stories, and I'm sure others will share some, but there are three I will tell before handing over the mic. The first story I didn't witness. It happened at Dodger Stadium when Steve, Arnie, and David attended a game. A big drunk guy hassled a woman sitting near them. No one did anything to stop the abuse until Steve did. Then the security took Steve and the brute away. When Steve returned to his seat, the entire section gave him a standing ovation. Steve was the definition of a stand-up guy. The second story is the annual call I would receive from the FBI about Steve when he held a high security clearance. I would verbally dance around and give the proper assurances regarding drugs. This was challenging, given that they were asking about the man famous for inventing the roller skate bomb. The third story happened when Steve and I were driving by my old house in Van Nuys, and he asked if I wanted to meet some legendary marijuana legalization advocate at a nearby head shop. I'll never forget the reverence that the proprietor's two adult sons showed Steve. It was clear that in the paraphernalia world, Steve was also a legend. These young men clearly enjoyed being with Steve, and Steve was cross-generational. I'd love to see some friendships grow among us today, particularly among those younger than my generation. You see, there can't be remarks about Steve without giving some guidance that Steve would like you to hear. He wanted good people to bond with one another. We're all connected to Steve in some way, and I encourage you to talk to each other while we celebrate Steve today, and hopefully make a date with someone here and find a reason to do stuff together you can enjoy. Get to know someone here better. Steve would like that. And it's my guess, you'll be happy you did. Okay, I think we've got another speaker here coming up. I think it's Cheryl Diamond. Oh, it's going to be Sean. I'm sorry. But Sean's a pretty good guy, so that's pretty good. Come on out here, buddy. Take it up.
Everyone knows what this is. Yeah, I didn't know either when I was in high school. So I took it to Steve because I figured he made it, yeah? But every pipe and bong I saw in high school had just one bowl, right? But Steve was like, no, that is the deal with this one. That's why I made this one. It has 6, right? So 6 bowls for one bong. And this was Steve, okay? So I'm gonna leave it here. And if anyone wants to imbibe later, by all means. So I'm part of that crew that was just spoken of, and I'm happy we mentioned multi-generational. I'll use my iPhone. You know, it's not particularly challenging to celebrate Steve. And he really, I think, was the right guy at the right time in the right place of Los Angeles. And I think really then, though, he'd probably be perfectly fitting and eccentric anywhere he was and went. So growing up, the Diamond family, we had some precious few friends. And my first memories of hanging with the Morrises and visiting Jenny, Susie, and Steve are right there on the towers on Nielsen. And I was pretty much amazed that I could go to their apartment on weekends, and there was a little convenience store down in the center of it, and I'd walk in and I'd walk out with like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 packs of Hostess donuts. And there was no exchange of money. So at that point, I basically said, I really want to go to the free store every single weekend I possibly can. And then I realized it was Steve putting it on the family tab the whole time, footing the bill and laughing about it. The Morris family would have Thanksgivings with us, and 4th of July was typically with Steve at the beach house or at Arnie's, where he knew exactly, and I will say I liked his barbecue, he knew exactly how to make a hot dog, and he'd slice it, no bun, mustard and ketchup, so you can mix it, do what you want with it. And then later, Arnie with the salted margaritas, super strong. And so many of my favorite holidays growing up, I was surrounded by Steve and family. And what's amazing is the unconditional love he showed for his friends, kids, me. And that was infectious. He even brought that out in my father. And I'll never forget my dad drawing femur bones on Sam Vinstein's pants one 4th of July. And it was awesome. It was infectious. After Susie and my dad passed away, Steve would meet me for dinner. I was in art school at UCLA. He set me up with the Morel Fascio family in Paris, and I sort of overstayed my welcome. And I think in exchange, they sent their son Louis here. And Louis, I know, because I've corresponded a lot on email, lived his absolute best life when he's right here in Venice, and that's because of Steve and the freedom and opportunity that Steve would provide for people around him. But I couldn't go without any meeting with Steve without hearing about the mountains, and I have climbed a lot. but he loved telling me about the hardest damn trip that my dad concocted for their backpack group. And I heard you talking about it earlier. And that was up to Lake Italy in a Sierra summer storm, which, as you know, get pretty hairy, pretty cold, pretty quick. And Steve was bringing up the rear, cursing at my father, hauling some ridiculous, massive, heavy Italian sausage and wine up in the middle of the Sierras. And my dad was far too principled to lend a hand because he couldn't believe he was bringing all that shit up there. So he just let Steve suffer it out and get to camp a few hours late, and the tents were set up, and the stove was cooked, the meals were good, and I think all of you guys would sit back and watch my dad's headlight climbing up the mountains because he couldn't get enough. And so in those talks with Steve, I learned a little about my dad and a little about why I am so stubborn and driven and won't stop at camp and keep going. So Steve spotted that in me, and he stoked it, and he could light it up, and he'd light each of us up like little rockets and kind of see where we landed and what we did with it, which is just an awesome thing to give to younger people. And so it wasn't to any surprise that in the last weeks I heard from Jenny, and it was from Steve to make sure and check on me and Michelle in the throes of him being sick himself. And I let Jenny know and I let Steve know that we are growing, we are happy, and we are in his embrace, right? And for the people who love the mountains, they return there. I think up in the cosmic Sierras, Steve, Arnie, my dad are enjoying that good wine and sausage that finally arrived and all the comedy to come. So we love you. I love you, Steve. Thank you.
As you can see, Steve touched people. Sean, that was great. I loved every word of it. So I think, Pat, you're up, kid. Oh, Manny, come on up. All right. He's on his way. This is Steve's brother. I think he beat him up a lot. I'm not sure.
They were busy fighting with two other people.
Dad, you want to sit on that chair behind you?
I don't know. All right, I'm here to fill in a lot of details. I've heard a lot of things, but I think I know a lot of things that nobody here knows about him. I want to go back to the year he was born in 1940, where we lived in the completely Italian section of Bensonhurst. In fact, we were the only Jewish family on the block. Now, Steve was only a little boy, an infant, but a lot of times you could tell a lot about a person's character and personality right away. It always amazed me how when you put Steve in a stroller and strapped him down, how he would never give up trying to break the springs and trying to get out, and he never stopped. And this is the way he was. He had this determination to do whatever he wanted. After that, my other brother, or the youngest brother, Paul, was born. Now my mother had 2 children, and we were living on the 3rd story in this apartment house. So we moved away to find a place where we were living on only 1 story. And Steve loved it there. He was now about, 2.5, 3 years old. He loved to run around. He loved to do things. But one morning, my mother came rushing in. She said, "Steve, where is Steve? I can't find him." We said, "Well, isn't he inside?" She said, "No," and she ran out. She ran out into the cold, windy streets of Bensonhurst. And there was Steve running around in his Dr. Denton's, just throwing him round in circles, so she finally brought him in. It was then I knew that Steve was a person that was kind of very strong in his ideas. He would do what he wanted, and he wouldn't take no for an answer. The third time happened about 2 or 3 years later. And he had the older brother, younger brother phenomenon, where wherever I would go, he would follow. He would go anywhere I wanted to. And we would go many times to a park that was about 5 or 6 blocks away. Now, when we walked in the street, it was okay, but he wouldn't let me hold his hand when we crossed the streets. He was very headstrong about that. And we got into the park, and what happened? I saw my friend Steve went to play with his friends, and then I looked around. Where was Steve? He wasn't there. So I went around the park about 3 times. I still didn't find him. Finally, I said, well, he must be home. But he was only about 4 years old, and I said, well, I just hope he was there. And he was there. Again, he wanted to do what he wanted to do, and he wanted to prove that he could do it without my help, and he did. Now, Steve went to elementary school. He was what I would call an average student. He didn't show anything good or bad about what he went. He went through elementary school and high school, and due to no fault of his own, he went to the wrong high school, and when he got out and graduated from high school, he could not get into a college, which was for him very difficult. And he spent about 1.5 years not doing anything. So finally, I told my mother to ask him and come to live in California with me. And this changed his whole life. He then came here, got married, went to college, had a daughter, got a job, graduated with a degree in electrical engineering, Tau Beta Pi, later got a bigger job at JPL, learned about real estate, and I would say he became a real mensch. He knew what he was doing, he knew real estate. And after that, the years kind of went by without us having any very much meetings. But one day he got to the age of retirement and he called me up. He says, "Manny, what do you do? I'm retired. I don't know what to do." And I said, "Well, you can do anything you want. I mean, I do nothing all the time and I'm great at it." So So luckily he didn't take my advice, because he became very astute in real estate. He did very well in the markets and at times, and he was very happy at the time he passed, because he just finished a big deal. Now, Steve, if I were to sum this up, and maybe I would hurt some people's feelings, but he had the Morris boys DNA. He was kind of headstrong, and I could even say was maybe at times a hothead and difficult to get along with. And of course, one other thing that I always remembered him by was that he was generous to a fault. If a contractor gave him a price on something, he would give him more. He thought he didn't want the guy to cheat himself. And that was it. But one thing I do know, that I will always love him as that little boy that roamed the streets with his Dr. Denton 75 years ago, and of the man who taught me how to get rid of the tenant when they weren't paying their rent.
Dad, what's a Dr. Denton?
What?
What's a Dr. Denton? What is a Dr. Denton?
A Dr. Denton?
Yeah, what is
That was a little pants with a trap door in the back. And I never know whether it was down when he was running in the streets or up. All I know was that's what he was wearing. So.
All right, that was, as they say, a great add-on. Maybe an add-in. Okay, Pat.
Hello, everybody. Speakers, we haven't collaborated about anything we were going to say today, so some things might be a bit of a repeat, but I think most of them would bear repeating because they're all about Steve, after all. And I hope all of you have had an opportunity to read the absolutely perfect portrait of Steve that Jenny posted online. And we're here really just to add some personal reminiscences and, fill out the picture a little bit. Our friendship began when I met Steve in 1964. He was a friend of a friend, and he was married to a young love, Connie, a really lovely person. By the time I met David in 1967, we were all already fast friends. David and Steve hit it off right away, Brooklyn boys. But if you met Steve 57 years ago, 57 days ago, or even 57 minutes ago, you probably know this about him. He was, to be sure, a unique, multifaceted man, and I feel certain you have never met, and I'm even more certain you will never meet anyone about whom you can say, he's like Steve Morris. Steve was funny. He could be caustic. He was very opinionated, almost as much as I am. He could hold a grudge, but he was loyal and tolerant of his friends' foibles. He cared and he loved deeply. He had strongly held views on politics, on social conventions, on human nature, on just about everything, and was eager to share them. He could converse easily with anyone, young or old. My father and he, both raconteurs, enjoyed each other's company and stories. He took an interest in the children of his friends, something like an uncle who would be on their side against their parents. When Matthew was 4, Steve called him on Christmas Eve, pretending to be Santa Claus. Excuse me. Steve was for sure stubborn. Take an evening from about 1968. We were at an Indian restaurant on Vine Street in Hollywood. It was such a memorable occasion, I can even still picture the room. Going out to dinner was a rather big thing then, not because of the pandemic, but because we didn't have a lot of money and didn't do it very often. Steve ordered lamb vindaloo. The waiter asked, mild, medium, or hot? Steve said, hot. And to the waiter's rather doubtful look, he repeated, hot. Bring it on, or words to that effect, he said to us. Well, you can imagine the conversation in the kitchen, right? The vindaloo arrived. Steve took a bite. His eyes started to open. By the third bite, the beads of sweat started to appear. Steve ate more. The waiters all stood aside, watching us. Steve, stubbornly refusing to admit defeat, ate enough vindaloo to keep his dignity intact, albeit with a heavy thirst and major indigestion the rest of the day and the next and the next. If you are in the relatively speaking 57-day or 57-minute group, as compared to me, and you observe Steve's kind of casual manner and speech, and I want to go on record that I tried to talk him out of saying ain't 1,000 times because he knew better, but he liked it, so of course I gave up. But you might not be aware of just how very, very smart Steve was. With only a bachelor's degree, which Manny mentioned, earned slowly, always while he was working as well, he more than held his own in demanding jobs, including at JPL, against colleagues with advanced degrees from prestigious universities. You have to enjoy picturing Steve schmoozing with, persuading, selling with the contracting officers at the Air Force, at NASA, the CIA, and all the while running the business, Easy Products. What you might know or remember, Steve had an inventor's imagination. His first major creation was the famous fat-sucking machine. Alas, like you, his friends all laughed and we made fun of him. A couple of years later, think about this, liposuction. Others made millions, and Steve never forgave our lack of confidence in his idea. Steve had a prodigious memory. You've probably heard some of his seemingly unlimited catalog of entertaining stories about his early Brooklyn life, his boyhood buddies. The stories were so good, you might have wondered if he was making them up. Mostly he wasn't, and alas, Netflix came too late. For example, in the winter of 1970, we happened to be in Brooklyn at the same time. Steve insisted we go out to dinner in some godforsaken corner of Brooklyn, wherever it was, to an Italian restaurant, not at all fancy, an Italian joint in Steve's vernacular. Steve claimed he knew it was a mafia hangout. Sure, good story, we said. Years later, when The Sopranos aired scenes in an Italian joint, we immediately thought it looked just like the place Steve had taken us to. In telling the stories, he perhaps might occasionally have embroidered the details of the events and the people a little bit. He was, after all, a great storyteller. But his vast memory bank included lines from books, plays, movies, songs, all kinds of trivia. He could precisely recall events long past. Who was there? What happened? Who said what? He was a savvy, as you've heard, and successful, most of the time, real estate investor. Jenny grins. Sometime back in the early 70s, based on a rumor of a prospective Disney resort in the Sierra, Jenny's laughing again, Steve bought property in Three Rivers near Mineral King. Norman's laughing too. He and David, and I must say right now that some of these stories really come from David, whose memory of all of these things is so vivid. Well, he and David set off on their first mountain backpacking trip. Steve confidently decided they should take a shortcut by following a stream. Hours later, ankle deep in mud and melting snow, soaking, freezing, they learned to appreciate why there are trails. Not to be deterred, 2 weeks later, another trek, this time, of course, on the trail. Soon after making camp, a massive lightning and thunderstorm arrived, bringing what felt like an avalanche of snow on their campsite. Their sleeping bags froze to the tent wall. Still undeterred, they signed up for the Sierra Club Mountaineering Training Course with Arnie Vinstein, whom you've already heard about. David and I had recently met him, and he, of course, became a lifelong close friend of all of us. Carol and Sam are with us today. And these three nice Jewish boys raised in the city became certified outdoorsmen, mountaineers. This led to many adventures, some of which you've already heard a little bit about, even camping in the snow. I just found a photo. I don't think you might not be able to see it, but I leave it here for you to see. But it's hard to believe, but this is actually Steve with his backpack in the snow at their campground. Tyler's not so sure. Tyler's not so sure. Steve and his trusted companions embarked on memorable annual backpacking trips, which you've heard a little bit about, venturing farther and farther into the high Eastern Sierra. Trips they spent the year in between planning. They were often joined by Chuck Diamond, whom you've heard about already. Chuck, who was absolutely fearless in the wilderness. And then Norman. They camped and fished the mountain lakes at long campfire evenings with entertainment provided in part by Steve's inexhaustible supply of stories and, of course, his other contributions. It was incredible, enviable camaraderie. No girls allowed. This was for sure a boys' club. And by the way, Steve had the idea if you put a string up around your tent, it would keep the bears away. Didn't. Eventually, aging backs and knees gave way to trips with pack animals instead of backpacks, then riding instead of hiking, and finally raft trips, the Green River, the Rio Grande, and the Colorado Rapids and all. On what turned out to be the last trip, at least riding trip, at least for Steve, he was very upset that the mule he had ridden on the 2 previous years' trips had retired. He reluctantly agreed to ride a horse. Norman's going to remember this. Though actually you can't really say that Steve had a great way with mules because the year before, this very missed mule had taken Steve to the wrong camp. But, you know. So at some point they were about to cross a tricky stream and David looked for Steve riding behind him. No Steve, no horse. They were spotted about 100 yards or so off the trail, the horse munching on the grass. "The horse won't go," yelled Steve. "It won't move." Steve's colorful, frustrated exhortations to the horse were to no avail. David rode up close to them. The horses, I guess, were in the same pack. They knew each other. I don't know, friends. And Steve's horse was persuaded to leave the grass behind and return to the trail with Steve, fuming. Never again, our Steve bellowed frequently as he and his reluctant horse rode on. It was, in fact, his first and last try with a horse. As far as Steve was concerned, no mule, no Steve. Did we say he was stubborn? These trips, though, became the legends of their friendships, often retold with laughter and deep affection. In long ago days of our young lives, without much money or email or cell phones, social media, whatever, our friendships, our tight-knit little group, was created and nurtured by being together. We had so many happy times, talking, laughing, eating, usually at each other's homes. I think of them now as the halcyon days of our lives. Steve took David out to a fancy lunch at Pacific Dining Care just 2 hours after our Matthew was born. Steve met Susie Galen, incomparable, unforgettable Susie. He met her through Arnie Vinstein, and if ever two people were soulmates, it was Steve and Susie's. Steve's bachelor days came to a screeching halt. It didn't take them long for them to realize they were made for each other. They got married in 1980. When Susie got pregnant, Steve, over the moon with joy, wanted to name a girl, baby, Brooke Lynn Morris. He didn't get much support for that idea, particularly from Susie, but a few years ago when he read about a celebrity naming a child Brooklyn, he felt vindicated. Steve was just ahead of his time on that, perhaps to Jenny's relief. They were such happy, happy days for Steve, so full of love. We always celebrated birthdays, and if nobody gave Steve a birthday party, he'd give one to himself. We celebrated ours and then our kids, all the big events of our lives. Our core group expanded when I met Kathy and Kathy Norman about 1981 or so. 1980, Kathy? We also often enjoyed times with Chuck and Cheryl. Life is not static. And over time, of course, many changes came as we aged. Other people came to play a big part in all of our lives. And as with all relationships, there were even misunderstandings and grievances. Although the pace of life made getting together less frequent, always the important moments, happy or sad, we were together. There's been terrible loss and profound sorrow. And we feel it again today. Of course, the most important thing to celebrate about Steve is what a good father he was. The proof is Jenny, her devotion and love for Steve, her very successful real estate career, and even more, the beautiful life she and Tyler, such immense you are, Tyler, have created with Sadie and Marnie. You know, from the moment Susie was diagnosed when Jenny was just, I think, 8, Steve faced the sad but inescapable responsibility of being not just a good father, but a superhero dad. When we lost Susie, Jenny was only 12. And although, to be honest, some of us longtime friends didn't agree with, or dare I say, even approve of his parenting style, which was rather laissez-faire, Jenny is the proof of how wrong we were to ever question or doubt him. When I was thinking about what to say at Jenny and Tyler's wedding, Steve shared Jenny's college application essay with me. It clearly and with such confidence written all of life's most important lessons she, at 17, had already learned, inspired by her mother and guided by Steve. My friendship with Steve began when we were very young, now old, with him gone. The first thing I do when thinking about him is the same as I did then. I smile.
I feel older right now. Okay. Alfred. Where are you, Alfred? Come on up, Alfred. I haven't seen you in ages. Long time. Good to see you. Come on, man. Share that JPL.
Yeah, I would like to share some of the JPL world. It was not all exciting. There were lots of nuts and bolts, but Steve tried to make it exciting. I mean, he rallied everybody, and it was a tough culture to penetrate. It took us a while, but we began to develop our own culture, our own friends, our own support group. And what I've done, I've reached out to a number of people, and I've asked them, I told them that Steve Morris had passed on, and I got various responses, all from the heart. I didn't give anybody here a lot of time to think about what they wanted to say. They just spoke intimately, and they have some very nice things to say about Steve. So I'm going to mention, well, look at this. I'm going to mention 5 names, 5 human beings and 2 robots. Yeah, even the robot had something to say. So I'm going to start off with Esther Rodriguez. Esther Rodriguez was our department administrator, but she really ran the department. I mean, the boss wasn't there. Oops, sorry. Thank you. The boss wasn't there, and he was sort of like major. He was in when he was out and out when he was in. So Esther would give us the heads up on what's going on in the department, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So what she had to say was, sorry to hear such sad news. Steve was a nice and decent man. The world will miss him. Esther wasn't one of our highfalutin engineers. She had worked her way up to be this senior administrative person. She was a Latina from a barrio in Texas. Yet she summed up what I think Steve is all about. It was sad news to hear. And I've written this so I can get through it in case I start falling apart. He was a nice and decent man, and the world will miss him. And I'll tell in a few minutes how Steve and I met. Pat beat me. I met Steve in 1965 on a cold September morning. Then when he told me he was from Brooklyn, New York, or Flushing Meadows, I said, nothing's cold here compared to what you went through. And he said, that's why I'm here. I'll never go. Anyway, continuing, then we had, at that time, a young man named Marv Miller. Marv Miller joined us after his Army service. He wasn't formally educated. He didn't have any college degrees. So it was tough making some headway for yourself at JPL without those degrees. Steve and I only had bachelor's degrees. It was a little tough for us, but banding together, we kind of survived the morass of what was going on there. So Marv said to me, I said, give me a few words, a couple of lines, and how you feel about Steve. So Marv said, he was like a brother to me. He helped me get through tough times. He opened my eyes and made me see the world from the other person's point of view. And coming from Marv, yeah, he was kind of uneducated. He was a very decent guy, but he was also, he had a very nice job in various places. He was a code breaker. Somehow he could see symbols and numbers roll across and make some sense out of them. So Marv cried when I told him that Steve, at first I told him that Steve was seriously ill, and then I had to break the news that Steve had passed. Next, we've got Les Deutsch on the list. Les said, "I am saddened by Steve's passing. I hope that he had a happy life." We both worked for Les off and on different times of our life there. Les had a band. In fact, he had two bands, a jazz band and a rock band. So if there are any weddings planned, Les would be very happy to play at your wedding. But Les was also the youngest PhD graduated at Caltech. He was heads above everybody at JPL. His background was in mathematics, and he was kind of a formal code breaker. Whatever Marv did, Les could put the mathematics to it and convince people that it was true. A great guy. I didn't add Les's preamble, which was, "Gee, Alfred, I'm always glad to hear from you," but not in this case. Have some happy news for me the next time you call. Our friend Lud Maliki. Lud Maliki was really a Zoroastrian in all sense of the word. His words were so sad. He had much more to offer the world. We worked with Lud for many years also, and he was really one of the decent guys. He was kind of left rudder, so we had to help him get into the center so he could do great things there and be rewarded for doing those great things. He's really the father of the atomic clock. So in our more or less 20 years at JPL, we met some kind of interesting people with lots of great accomplishments. Then we have one of the big bosses, Larry Dumas. He responded to me by saying, "It's sad to hear that Steve has passed on." He was our deputy director, our operations officer in normal terms. And we used to see Larry on occasion because we had a secret assignment from him. And the secret assignment was change the face of the laboratory, make it look more like America. Men, women, gay, straight, black, brown, yellow, red. Get some people in here. And I said, well, how do we do that? I said, well, that's why I got you guys in here. You'll figure it out. And I said, okay, what role do you want to play? Do I want us to come and see you? He said, yeah, that's okay. But anybody gets in your way, call me, and I'll help you fix it. So he got my own boss involved in this, and they were both very strong believers in wanting to see faces of America at the Jet Propulsion Lab. I mean, we sort of succeeded. There's always a lot of work to do, but we left it with younger people. I mean, thanks. We old guys don't want to carry the train all our lives. Okay, the robot I promised, the Mars Perseverance rover. He emailed back and he said, "Hi, Steve. Thanks for providing me with a wonderful brain. I'll use it to advance human knowledge and maybe discover life on Mars." Well, God bless him. I hope the rover does find the essence of life on Mars. That'd be grand. And I hope that I can see it in my lifetime. So, the last robot, I'm the last robot. I learned much from Steve. He made me open my eyes to the world and nurtured me to embrace change and roll with the punches. I took a lot of nurturing. And he gave me the nurturing, and I saw all sides of Steve, but you could accept them all as a package because you knew that his friendship would deliver you wonderful things, wonderful outcomes would come about. And two of the wonderful outcomes, Susie and my dear wife, Jeannie, were pregnant around the same time, and our children were born around the same time, the month of April. Adam was a little bit early, and Jenny came a little bit later, so it wasn't quite the same day, which is what Steve was hoping for, and so was I. Gosh, look at all these birthday parties we got to enjoy at Steve and Susie's house. It was just wonderful. We got to meet a lot of you at the birthday parties. Wonderful memories. Okay, the bottom line is Steve was a wonderful guy. He was a mentor. He was an older brother, and he rolled with the punches and showed me personally how to roll with the punches. And at JPL, there were lots of punches from here and there. Most of them were metaphysical punches, the worst kind. So where did I meet Steve? Well, Pat beat me. I met him in September of 1965. It was the beginning of our junior year in engineering at Cal State Long Beach. It was a cold and rainy California day, and then the murders began. Oops, I forgot to cross that out. I had been walking down a steep incline carrying lots of books. In those days, the engineering books were heavy. I mean, these things, could have weighed 5-10 pounds apiece. And there I was with all this stuff. And what was going on in Long Beach State was kind of neat. The fine arts department was rolling out some beautiful sculpture, and they were putting it on these steep lawns. And I walked over in the steep lawn. It was wet, cold, and slippery, and I almost lost my balance. And out of nowhere, a guy comes up to me. I didn't know him at all. And there was a picture here with a younger Steve Morris. He looked like that. And the first things that came out of one side of his mouth was, "What the hell are you doing? You're going to kill yourself." The next thing came out was he grabbed all the books and helped me get down the steep incline. And we headed for the engineering quad, for he and I, a couple of other people got together, one of them being the only woman in engineering that decade. And that's the way it went with Steve. He was there for you during the good times, during the tough times, his and yours. And so I've known him for about 56 years, and and the things that really stand out are the birthday parties at Steve and Susie's. Love those birthday parties, and Adam got to meet lots of people, see lots of people, very different from the people in Pasadena, which is great. And he got to know my mom and dad. The story about the Vinandulu brings up that I think he gave up Vinandulu, but he went on to salsa, my mother's salsa. He used to go home with me for lunch once a week, and she'd have this marvelous salsa on the table. And he and my father would have a contest on who had the most salsa on their dinner or on their lunch. And Steve beat my father. He shouldn't have done that. But he apologized for it. And my mom, of course, saved Steve and said, "Oh, my father was also an Alfred. Alfred, leave him alone. He's a very nice man, and he loves my salsa." So as a birthday present for Steve in one of the decades, I don't recall which one, Mom gave Steve something called a molcajete, a mortar and pestle. So for years, he would grind his own chilies, blend his own garlic, and create my mom's salsa. But he had to admit to her at one of the birthday parties that he wasn't even coming close. From my standpoint, it was pretty good. So God bless Steve. And I hope to see him again. Thank you.
Okay, I think we're winding down here. Francine? One more after Francine.
Hi. Some time ago, I read a book entitled Conversations with God. And essentially what it taught me is that every morning when we wake up, we need to give thanks for something. We need to find something to give thanks for. So the morning after I watched Steve take his last breath was a pretty dark time for me. And the book said, even in your darkest of days, to find something to be grateful for. So when I woke up the next morning, I thanked God for allowing me to have Steve in my life for 15 years. He was the most loyal, honest, generous man I have ever known. And he will always be in my heart and in the hearts of my children and my grandchildren. Another one of his attributes was his sense of humor. We laughed for days and days, I mean, hours and hours. So the last 6 days of his life I spent with him in his room. And at one point, it was over Passover. I said, I'm going to leave you for 3 hours and drive down to Long Beach to my daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter for Passover, to wish them happy Passover. I'll be back in 3 hours. And it was a Sunday. So I get back in time for 3 hours to his bedside, and he says, how was the traffic? And I said, oh, it just zipped. I just zipped down to Long Beach, visited my kids, and zipped back up again. And he said, well, you know why there is no traffic on the LA freeways on Sundays? And I said, why? He said, the Protestants are sleeping in, the Catholics are at church, and the Jews are all in Palm Springs. So that was his sense of humor, one of his many, 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 many jokes. His last dying words before he stopped speaking, the last day he didn't speak at all, but his last dying words were the ones that let him rest in peace. And they were this exactly. Jenny told me that I was a very good father.
Thank you, Francine, again, for those last 6 days. I know you made him very, very comfortable and happy. It was beautiful. Okay, Kathy, my lovely wife.
The disadvantage, of course, of speaking last is that everybody's saying all these wonderful things and attributes about Steve, who was obviously charming and eclectic. And I don't think anybody mentioned that he has twinkling eyes. And I loved his twinkling eyes. So that's something new. So I had to think, since I knew I was going to be last, what were my special experiences with Steve? So one of the things is that I really hoped that when my kids, particularly my boys who are here, David and Hansi, were teenagers, that they would find an adult that they could relate to, because I couldn't ever relate to my parents' friends. And Steve was, as we've heard from some of the other young people here, he was that person. He was cool beyond measure with a real childlike sense of fun. And when he found something that he really liked, like playing video games, he was all in. And one of my favorite memories of Steve was with his gaming chair. I mean, who knew somebody who was 60 or 70 years old with a gaming chair that would sit in front of his, TV and play video games? And he wanted my boys to come over and play with him. And so he was, and my boys were very happy to oblige. Now, I don't know what else went on at Steve's house with my boys besides the video games, but I think it had something to do with the evil weed. But all I know is that endeared Steve even more to my boys. I never heard about it actually from either Steve or the boys, but it's just my suspicion. So Steve played a really important role in my life in showing my kids that avoiding grown-ups would really cause them to miss out on some really fun times. And as other people have also said, Steve was sincerely interested in my kids and was, unlike other people that just kind of perfunctorily ask, how your kids are doing, show me a picture, Steve really went all out. So he took David and Hans, I believe, to JPL, arranged a private tour, gave them little statuesques of the Mars rover, and talked for years about how David would constantly ask him questions at JPL and never would stop to listen to an answer. So even though David drove Steve crazy, I know that when Steve needed somebody to do his bookkeeping and organizing at his house, he hired David when David needed a job, and paid him hourly to come over and look at these like stacks of unopened mail, bills, bank statements, stuff that went by years because it wasn't that important to Steve. And I have to say also that even when Steve wasn't really that mobile, he and his cousin Ronnie, where is Ronnie? I don't see him. He went home, but they went to Hollywood just a year right before the pandemic. They actually went to Hollywood at nighttime, which I knew Steve hated to do because he had to drive home to his home in Manhattan Beach just to see Hans perform in a comedy show, which was really an amazing thing for him to do. I don't know that he thought it was so funny, but everybody else was laughing, but Steve and Ronnie were just, kind of sitting there. Steve was obviously also, as we've heard, a man of very strong opinions. And one of the things I want to say, and it's probably because of Jenny, but also he was a very strong feminist, always. And one of the last arguments I had with him was the fact that he said he would never vote for Joe Biden in the presidential election because he was so upset about the way Joe Biden treated Anita Hill at the Anita Hill hearings. And we told him basically, you got to get over it, and you cannot vote for the other guy. So I don't know who he voted for, but he was adamant that he was not going to vote for Joe Biden. He voted for Biden. Oh, thank you, Jenny. He also had really strong opinions about how long chicken needed to stay on the barbecue. And he was forever turning it over and over and over. And it was always a game to get the chicken off the barbecue before Steve totally dried it out at all of our 4th of July parties. So a few more stories. Throughout our friendship with Steve, he was always disappearing for like a week at a time. I thought it was Palm Springs, but it turns out I asked somebody who also went. It was somewhere near San Diego. And he said he would go to this spa and he would come back like 20 pounds lighter. And I said to Norman, I want to go. I want to go to this spa and lose 20 pounds. It sounds great. And Norman said, Kathy, I really don't think you want to go to this spa if you knew what was going on there. So he never told me what it was, but I think it was colonics. And I think it was like everyday colonics. And he's right. I would have never wanted to go there. So keeping secrets was a thing among this little boys club that they had. And they celebrated each other's birthdays. It was mentioned, but what wasn't mentioned is that they had apparently this strip club on Sepulveda and Sawtell that they visited that they also never talked about. But one of the funniest things about this whole thing with the strip club, and that none of the spouses or partners ever really cared about, was that there was and by the way, this is Susie's vest, so I thought I'd bring it along. She was very 60s. One of the funny things about this strip club was that I could swear it was Arnie's house, and it was 4th of July, and there was this woman that shows up, and I think she showed up with Steve, and nobody knew who this woman was. And she wasn't really introduced properly to anybody. And we kind of got the idea that it was somebody who had been, who they made their acquaintance at one of these birthday dinners at this strip club. This woman who showed up once or twice at an event, and then we never saw her again. So the secret has been kept, and I still don't know who this woman was. Okay, here comes my favorite Steve story. My favorite Steve story is I was a prosecutor in the late 1980s or early 1990s, and Steve was called to jury service in Santa Monica, where I was assigned. And during jury selection, I don't know if any of you hopefully have been on a jury, but you're asked, do you know anybody who is a part of the criminal justice system? So he said, well, I know Kathy Mader, and she's a prosecutor. So this naive prosecutor thought, well, if this guy says he knows Kathy Mader, and she's a prosecutor and I'm a prosecutor, then I'm going to keep him on the jury. So according to the prosecutor afterwards, this was like a dead bang case. There was no reason why this person was a young man should have been convicted. It shouldn't have been convicted. And Steve explained that the first vote was 11-1 for conviction, and we can all guess who the one was. It was Steve. Well, Steve invented some wild explanations as to why the other jurors should not vote guilty. And at the end of all of that, he had convinced everybody to return a verdict of not guilty. So they walked this guy out. And the prosecutor put a sign up in the front of the DA's office and said, if anyone says that they're a friend of Kathy Mader, do not allow them on your jury. So that was Steve. So I'm sure Steve would have dearly loved having this party in his honor, as we all know, because he loved having his own birthday parties. And so thank you. He was a dear friend. He provided such colorful and memorable times to all of us and really showed us what a loyal friend and a generous friend and what family values were all about. Thank you.
Pretty sweet living with her, let me just say. Okay, it's up to you, buddy.
So I wanted to say thanks to everyone for sharing their memories with us. Also, if you didn't get a chance to speak, there's an opportunity to write down some of your memories over there on or this table over here behind you. There's also some food. But before I let you go, I want to say a few thank yous to everyone. First, I want to thank Jenny, who worked so hard to make sure this event was meticulously organized, decorated, and crafted. Thank you for providing such a special place for us to honor your dad. I know you have agonized over every detail, which Steve would not want you to do, but I know he appreciates this and everything else you've done for him during his life. You are deserving of every bit of love and affection he bestowed upon you. You are truly an honor to his name. To Devin Stoll, thank you for being an auntie to our kids and a sister to Jenny and helping set this all up. Without you, this wouldn't have been possible. We're blessed to have you in our lives. To Brad Neal, thank you for letting us use this place to celebrate Steve in a place so close that he's always held dear to his heart. And thanks to your team. To Sean, Kathy, Pat, Manny, and Alfred, thank you. To Dinesh and Lillian, I want to thank you guys for helping us with Steve in his last days. You guys helped us navigate a very difficult medical system and probably avoided a lot of pain and suffering for him. So we are forever grateful for your assistance and also for being our family. And Norman, thank you for emceeing and thank you for sharing your stories. So, and Francine, I want to thank you for being there for Steve in the last days. You really gave us a lot of comfort as well, not just Steve, and allowed us to, be able to be there for him and take care of our family. Without your assistance, we would not have been able to really get through those last days. So thank you. And I just want to thank all of you. And may Steve's memory be a blessing to all of you. Thanks, guys. Please, there's a lot of food inside. Go inside and grab some food.
Oh, okay. No, it's on. The chamotzi. I'm just going to say it. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Amen.
Oh, no, not at all. Do you think I should play for a little bit?